Freelance had again passed through Isle Royale's North Gap and into Washington Harbor, the long, deep, and rocky fjord which leads to the park's southern entry point at Windigo. That morning, Vicki and I had left Grand Marais on the north shore of Lake Superior and made a fast and easy passage to the national park. And we have actually lost count on how many times we have visited the wonderful wilderness at Isle Royale. It's a lot, but cruising up here, so very close to the Canadian border, never really gets old. Instead, it's always a treat. And in this special year 2020, it seemed like a perfect place to keep our distance from the people in the cities and towns, at least for a while. Our plan was to spend the next 2 weeks enjoying some of our favorite places at Isle Royale and have the company of our friends Dwayne and Mar of the power cruiser Innisfree. They had passed us by on the way from Grand Marais and were now waiting for us at the Windigo dock. This time we didn't have to check in with the rangers. Instead, we had called the NPS headquarters at Houghton to file our tentative float plan and get our permit in advance. It was all very convenient and avoided contact with the personnel at the visitor center, which we greatly appreciated in this year of social distancing. Windigo was much quieter than usual, except for the construction of the new store. It's right across from the fuel dock and will be a beautiful timber frame building with a large deck when it's finished. The boat traffic seemed to be the same as always, even with the absence of the ferry boats, which were shut down due to the COVID-19 concerns. You would, of course, have thought that the lack of ferry boats would mean that there would be no hikers visiting the island, but the small float planes kept bringing them in. The planes were very busy, and it was great fun watching them take off and land on the water. They're flying out of Houghton on Michigan's Upper Peninsula and Grand Marais in Minnesota. The airfare is not exactly cheap, but there seem to be plenty of people willing to spend it for a visit to the remote national park. While we stayed at the Windigo dock, the sheltered bay behind Beaver Island always had several boats anchored in it. Some were flying the familiar Great Lakes Cruising Club Burgee, and some the yellow Q for quarantine signal flag from the spreaders. The Q flag uses may have been somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it sure seemed appropriate for 2020. I should mention it's well worth your while to spend time at Windigo and not just rush on to some of the quieter places at the 45-mile-long national park. Besides the exhibits and amenities here, there are great trails for day hiking. One of the days we walked with Dwayne and Mar to the large campground east of the docks. It's an easy path, and there are thick patches of tempting thimbleberries along the way. The path gets narrower the further you go on and takes you to areas where you are likely to see moose. There are about 2,000 of them at Isle Royale, but there isn't any guarantee you will see any of them. We didn't come across a single moose during this particular walk to the campground shelters. But the day before, Dwayne and I had one of them suddenly trot past us by about 50 feet when we were leisurely looking at the construction of the new store by the docks. We shoved Freelance off after 3 enjoyable days at Windigo. It was 7:45 in the morning when we left. Our buddy boat, the motor cruiser Innisfree, would leave much later. They often go about 20 knots, while we usually do about 6.5 knots with our engine. So they would catch up and pass us on the way to Chippewa Harbor, which was our destination. And we had discussed the possibility of going to Malone Bay or Hay Bay, but decided to instead head straight to Chippewa on the southeast side of Isle Royale. All the great anchorages at Isle Royale, it is by far our favorite. But first we had to get out of the 5-mile-long Washington Harbor. There are 3 ways you can exit it to the south. Our preferred one is a channel between Booth and Washington Islands and into Great Grace Harbor. The channel is plenty deep, but it's somewhat narrow in spots, so it's best to go slow with a bow lookout. It was, of course, much easier to pass through when it was buoyed, but it's aged to navigation where we moved years ago. Regardless, Vicki and I certainly didn't have any trouble in the channel, and quickly went through it into Grace Harbor. From there we had just 2 miles to go to the Cumberland Point buoy. Along the way we could see the distant Rock of Ages lighthouse off to starboard, before we made our turn southeast at the buoy and set a course down along the shore towards the head. It was another fine summer day to be out on the water. When we got to the head, we gradually curved northeast around the southern tip of Isle Royale, dodged a few motorboats, which were having a great time trolling for trout and whitefish in the deep, and stayed well southeast of the many small islands and dangerous reefs that shelter the huge Siskiwit Bay. We were off Isle Royale Light on Menagerie Island at about 1 p.m. That island is the most easterly of the narrow chain of islands, and by the large opening into the bay. We now had just 7 miles to go to Chippewa Harbor. When coming towards it from the southwest, the rocky shore along this stretch of Isle Royale looks somewhat like a wall, making the entrance to Chippewa difficult to see. Fortunately, there is a white marker on the bluff above it that helps to guide you to it. And there is, of course, always GPS. Once you are inside the opening, the channel ultimately narrows down and winds its way through wicked reefs. It can be challenging if you're not familiar with it. You should definitely consult the Great Lakes Cruising Club guides or Bonnie Dawes Superior Way before you enter here for the first time. And go slow and with a sharp bow lookout. Of course, that's something always to keep in mind for all the channels and cuts at Isle Royale National Park. Their edges are nearly always rocky and jagged and are very unforgiving. They always require careful piloting. Heading into the first basin, you will to starboard see a T-shaped dock, which is also used as a ferry landing. We passed it by and headed towards the back basin, but I should mention the first basin is well protected from the open lake and a wonderful place to stay overnight. Vicki steered us through the Narrows and towards our destination in the second basin. It's very beautiful, quiet, and a true hurricane hole. It might blow gale on Lake Superior, but in here, you would hardly know it. As we expected, the motor cruiser Innisfree was tucked into the cove down by the creek, and Dwayne and Ma were patiently waiting for us. When Vicki and I tried to anchor, we had some unexpected trouble getting a good set. It was something we had never experienced before at the spot, which has a good mud bottom. It puzzled us for a while, and we made several attempts until we finally realized the anchor was fouled. As soon as the anchor was cleared, everything worked as normal, and we got a good set. When we were all squared away after the day's run, we settled in and just relaxed for the rest of the afternoon, and looked forward to spending the next several days in this beautiful anchorage and exploring it in our dinghy.